Coming up, a vital conversation about one of education's big blind spots, media literacy. We're having a moment right now, America is. A moment that can't be accurately described without mentioning the stunning lack of media savvy on the part of many Americans and the corrosive effect this is having on our discourse. If students are not being given opportunities to access, analyze, and evaluate print, digital news, and social media, indeed, to paraphrase today's guest, if the fish are not being taught about water, then we must really ask ourselves why. Stay tuned for a great conversation about how we got here and where we just might go to get out of this mess. Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. In a January report from the RAND Corporation for Public Policy, Alice Hugo and her co-authors wrote, quote, individuals need particular skills to navigate entertainment and news media, online social media, and misinformation challenges associated with our interconnected online world. However, it is not clear whether the U.S. education system is providing students with the competencies necessary to contend with this environment. Close quote. The report, called Truth Decay, goes on to lay out troubling trends in American society, including increasing disagreement about facts and a blurring of the line between opinion and fact. For each trend, the report then offers educational steps to combat them. Rand's discussion of education's shortfall in this area really resonated with me. Like many of us, I was raised and then later trained in methods of thinking about sources like the CRAP test or the IB's origin, purpose, value, and limitations method. But as digital literacy teacher Mike Caulfield has pointed out, these methods do not translate well into our new media environment, leaving us exposed to confusion and manipulation. And yet, schools have been very slow to adapt. My guest today has been thinking about the intersection of media, technology, and American culture and society for decades. Kerri Redding is a photographer and media teacher at Washington International School in D.C. Kerri's also just an awesome human and a great storyteller, and you're really going to enjoy hearing what Kerri has to say. Today's episode also has a jam-packed list of resources in the show notes. You can go there for any and all of the resources mentioned in our conversation. All right, I'm happy to welcome on the podcast now, digital griot, new media guru, progressive anti-racist, homo sapiens seeker, and educator, Kerri Redding. Kerri, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, Dan. It's so good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. You are someone with an extensive career thinking about technology and media, not just and its relationship with students and teachers, but with humans. Maybe first introduce yourself a bit to my audience, your background and why and how you get into media.
Sure. I am a very proud Gen Xer, child of the 70s. And my parents, I am a person who is of African American descent. I am a person whose lineage is someone who's descended from American chattel slavery. And in the 70s, my parents landed in DC, Washington, DC. That's where I was born and raised. And because there was so much talk about moving forward as a family and what it meant for my family to put me in private schools, which was a big deal. And I was one of few in private schools. I was taught a lot about observation to learn how to fit in. What are people doing? What should you do? And I also had a natural inclination toward theater, which led me to majoring in theater in college, technical theater. I have terrible stage fright. So I'm glad we're not on video because I still do have terrible stage fright today. But technical theater, and I'm also a student of sociology. And at that time, I was an early adopter for the internet. So I remember the internet before it was the graphical user interface that we have today. And I'm also a person who's part of the queer community. And so I found a lot of community on the internet really early. People like me, lives like me, normalizing my experience, which was so important to my identity and my development. And so I'm of that age where, I had a cell phone really early on. When the internet turned into a GUI, I was so curious. It was a literal window into other people's lives for a while. I was a vlogger for a little while when vlogging became a thing, blogging and vlogging. And I went to graduate school for human development because with my background in theater and I was a dancer, I really didn't I felt like I didn't understand how people worked when they kept saying that art imitates life. I was like, I don't really understand the thing we're imitating, so let me go back to the source. And I was working with students, I was working in schools, and telling stories for understanding was something that we often did with children. Talk to us about who you are, tell your story, and I've when media was new, right? When video cameras were new in schools, and we were doing movie clubs, and you could do little films about students. I was always that person. I was somewhat technically inclined. I'm the kid who got in trouble for taking apart their Atari. Um, Prior to Christmas morning, I had, snuck downstairs, opened what I shouldn't have, taken it apart. I did put it back in the box. So when it got opened by my brother on Christmas, my parents were like, "This is defective," because of course there were extra screws in the bottom, things I couldn't figure out where they went back to. It worked, but I've always been inclined in that way and curious about our performance in society, who we are, and watching my parents struggle in their respective careers. My mom was a teacher, and my father was a lawyer here in Washington, D.C., and D.C. government. And being one of the firsts or onlys and talking about their experience as African Americans in that way, I got to see when they, turned it on and turned it off. And so the idea of performance and who we are and how we present ourselves has always been something that's been really fascinating to me. So media was a natural evolution in that way. I wanted to be a filmmaker at one point, and so I was exploring that with my students as well. But as I was thinking about today, and I was thinking about this evolution for myself, because I was writing some things down, I'm a big doodler and drawer. And so what I have in front of me right now is a two-page spread where I was doodling last night and writing and trying to come up with my origins of this. How did I get here? How did this become so interesting? And I thought about like what I've already shared about school and some of my family's experiences. Something that was also really seminal was my parents didn't have very many photographs of themselves as children. And so from as long as I can remember, my father had a camera and he was trying to capture events. And we need to have pictures. We need to, prove that this happened. You need to see yourself on the wall. There were lots of pictures in my home of our family and other people. And that led to my own interest in photography, and that is something I also do. I'm a professional photographer. But the idea of how we present ourselves and who we are, and then when the internet was young, and it was primarily AOL, and chat rooms were the thing, um, learning about the idea of personas. And you can be whoever you want to be. And for someone who lives in a body like myself in this society, in this country, to have a space to inhabit where you can completely define the relationship because they don't know how old you are, what race you are, what gender you are, and have no preconceived notions, opened up a whole new way to communicate, positively and negatively, obviously. I mean, we've seen the long tail of that in our society, positively and negatively. And so I have worked with students in media and technology adoption in progressive schools, Quaker schools, Montessori schools. I'm now in an international baccalaureate school. And looking at the use of educational technology and the use of media through all of those lenses has refined my understanding throughout the years. And it's all based on my understanding of human development and my innate curiosity about people. I'm someone who loves people. I think humans are awesome. I love to learn about humans that are different. Um, and so that origin is really about a curiosity as I saw the world, because I was told, in the 80s, I watched the wall come down in college, and the world was coming together. And it was like, well, how can we use these awesome tools to connect us, to learn more about each other, to move toward a more unified society? as an educational technologist, I was, like I said, an early adopter. So I was one of the first directors of academic technology in a New York City independent school when we were still wiring buildings, when computers were still new, and you were still having those conversations with teachers about why you should use this tool. I can remember, assigning computers every fall and putting a computer in a classroom. And I had a tug of war with a math teacher who was an older math teacher and a brilliant teacher, a really beloved teacher in the community, who refused to adopt technology. And we were just trying to get him to do his grades there, not get on the internet or anything yet, just do your grades digitally. And so it became a game every year. I would put the computer in his classroom during the prep days for school. And by the end of the day, the computer was outside in the hall once again. And we'd do this 4 or 5 times together. It was just and until we could have a conversation about why this was useful. So I'm still a believer that these tools can free us, but our tools have advanced beyond our communal understanding of how they work. And so we're being manipulated in many ways right now. The lack of digital literacy, and media literacy being taught in schools because of, I think, in some ways, the myth of the digital native. I remember when that was posited. Um, and I thought a lot about it. I was so happy to have a paradigm in which to talk about how we interact with technology. And, there was that myth that because you were born into a society where it already exists, you understand how it works innately. Yes and no. You may be able to navigate, but what I discovered, and when talking with students, is they didn't have any words for what they were doing. They didn't have any understanding. It was a kinesthetic understanding of what to do, but they couldn't break it down to deconstruct it or to construct it for themselves. And that's where I saw the danger, because it was almost, any technology that's so far advanced that you don't understand is indistinguishable from magic. And we were moving into this really dangerous area of not knowing what was happening behind the scenes and just saying yes for convenience. I mean, which is a completely human trait. It's a completely human trait to take the easy road around things. And so that's been my examination, and that's what I continue to do.
I love the long view and the personal connection to all of this. I think you just touched on about 6 different subtopics we could come back to in further episodes. I also, I love hearing perspectives on pre-corporate internet. I mean, I can remember that. I remember in college making my own websites, but I think for someone like me, being white, being male, the transition from pre-corporate to corporate internet, what we have today, probably it's not as jarring a transition maybe for people of communities like you talk about, people of color, the queer community. But I'm so fascinated by the freedom with which people talk about. They talk about the freedom of that early internet. It's really interesting.
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing. I don't know if you've seen the new Pixar movie, Soul. I'm a huge Pixar fan. I will put that out there. I am not paid by Pixar. I just happen to love them. Um, but when the character moves to a non-corporeal being, and the way that it was done in the movie, I thought was quite beautiful. Because I'm a movie buff, I followed the production. It was being made. I watched all the specials about it. Um, for people of color in a racialized society, we are seen as our racialized selves first, and we are not granted the same. You are an individual. We are a representative. We are a symbol representative of a group, right? Unless you get to know us. And that's a constant struggle as part of the double consciousness that exists in our society. And so that early internet, when there was none of this, really, I mean, when I say freeing, I still have volumes that I printed out of conversations with certain people, which really influenced my lives. And it's like a book I helped co-write that I reread because it reminds me, um, yeah, it reminds me of the promise of what technology was, because we've fallen into so many pitfalls now. We have been overwhelmed by the tsunami of media information without understanding its construction, which has led, in my humble opinion, my opinions are my own, to some of the difficulties we're having in modern society, agreeing to what is true.
Yeah, let's get to some of that. So for a number of years, I wouldn't say I've been thinking about media literacy, but I've been struggling and frustrated with the media that we do use in schools. I feel like it's just fallen behind, sort of become just the purview of librarians and not really the real world. And so a few months ago, I was at a virtual conference and I attended a session of yours, and it was one of the best conference sessions I'd ever attended. Your discussion of media literacy was poignant and spot on. But what I really loved about it was you talked about the why. You gave the teachers in that session a reason to care. So tell us now, Kerri, why should teachers, parents, school districts care about media literacy when they've got all these other pressures of things that they need to do?
Somewhere in the last 20 years, as the entire planet has become more interconnected and we have had, more and more technological accessibility to larger amounts of people, the social benefits, if you will, of that have outweighed and overshadowed our necessity, our need to understand how and why it's done. And there are people in our world who have taken advantage of that because they understand the language of media to manipulate others. And like I said, it's completely human for us to choose the path of least resistance. It's completely human for us to skip reading the 35-page terms of service, if you printed it out, for some of our larger social media companies, and just say yes, and not understand what we're saying yes to because we really want to get to the other side.
So is it that we no longer have the ability to take apart the Atari?
It's not that it's too complicated, it's that we don't care how it's put together because the what we get from it is such a reward that we don't often see the necessity in understanding how it's put together. In the same way, for some people, not all people, but for some people, you go out to eat, you go to a restaurant, and you order a burger. Well, most people are not asking, where was the cow born? How was the cow raised? How was the cow treated? What hormones were used in the cow? How was the meat prepared before it got to me? Most people aren't asking that. They're just going, hey, that looks delicious. I'm going to eat it. And I use a food analogy because in the presentation that you attended, I also talk about our media diets and what we take in and how we take things in. And I like I said, I'm a big lover of technology. I'm a big lover of design too, and understanding systems in society. Um, when when technology was new and computers were new and in schools, when they were new in schools and being used in schools, there was one school of thought that we needed to teach computing. And I looked, when I was doing my early research about this, to develop curriculum around media literacy and information communications technology. The places I was looking, Australia was one of the first places where they had put laptops in schools. And so there was a lot of research about how students were working with computers. And there was this sort of Venn diagram that was emerging of overlapping understandings about the use of a tool, the way that a pencil is a tool, the mediated communication and what that did in a classroom. Um, take that seed and go to what is branched out of that. Well, mediated communication, we're talking about younger generations right now that have difficulty with face-to-face contact. They'd rather text you in the same room than have a conversation with you. People have lamented the lost art of conversation and civil discourse. Well, if most of your communications are happening digitally, which removes 80% of tone and nuance for human communication, um, that those ideas transmitted out of context and without someone there to help you translate and understand, where did it come from, why did this person say this, in what context is this being said, there's some danger there that is very much akin to, if you want to take it back to the analog world, when we first started banning certain books, ideas being dangerous, and people thought they could contain them by getting rid of the physical piece. But now those ideas are being transmitted digitally around the world at lightning speed. The why of this is most schools say that they want to develop lifelong learners. Most schools say that they want to develop a culture of thinking, and you want to Develop and nurture the disposition for critical thinking. Well, that is a habit of mind that must be developed through practice. Like any skill, it is a muscle that you must exercise. And if you're not taught that, and the key there, that is the media literacy piece, and you blindly are consuming. Imagine going to a restaurant with a blindfold on and saying, you know what, I'm just a little hungry. I don't really care what you bring me. You can't see it, and you just mindlessly take it in. And when you're done, 5 days later, someone says, "Did you know that that food that you got was actually recycled out of the dumpster, et cetera, and so on? It's not nutritious, it's not good for you, but you didn't think about that before you sat down." Well, that's what we do sometimes when we turn on our computers. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to do some doom scrolling. I don't know what's going on. We talk about getting lost down the rabbit holes in the internet of where we go and who wrote that and how did I get here. The why is so that we can continue to agree on common facts of truth, because reality is a construction that we agree upon. We agree that we should behave a certain way. We agree what facts are. We make those agreements. And when we stop agreeing about some things that are provable and, to my mind, true, we enter a dangerous area for society. How do we move on together?
I love this food analogy. There's a whole sub genre of books and websites dedicated to what I think you could call food literacy and encouraging people to really understand where their food comes from. So then, what is media literacy? If you had to define what that means for a school, sort of the bones of a media literacy program, well, what is that?
I resonate with one of the resources you shared with me was the recent RAND report around media literacy, and I resonate with a lot of what was said in the preamble, if you will, to the report about the confusion around media literacy over the years. Because, as I said, it's a Venn diagram of overlapping skills and understandings, and like you said earlier, some have relegated it to the libraries. This about information literacy and research skills, which live over here. Is it about understanding and managing social media, which really kind of lives in the personal? It's kind of a half personal, half professional, or half educational, depending on your school community. And media has evolved also over time. And so, how do you quantify something that is still evolving in that way? So, I literally, I mean, I'm a person, I looked up words, right? So, what is the definition of media? Um, and how it's changed over time. So to be media literate for a student and for schools to latch on to media literacy, students have to understand that everything digital is a construction. Digital is not natural. Humans make decisions to put things into the digital sphere. And so to be literate about that is to understand how things work, um, and not only, and so I believe, and when I developed curriculum, this is what I taught. I taught you about how a computer works. I taught you about how a network works. I taught you about internet companies and what their reasons are. Why are you seeing all these commercials on the side of your social media feed? How do algorithms work for personalization? Um, and so the I still believe in the four principles of media literacy, and that students need to be able to talk about how they access information. And when you talk about access today, we're also talking about what does your family subscribe to? Not in terms of belief, but let's talk about just socioeconomics. Are you a person that has fast and free and open internet without any filters on it? Can you access it whenever you want? Are you a person who, and there are still people today who are using services like America Online, where the content is filtered, right? What is your landing page? Are you a Yahoo News person? Are you a CNN person? Are you an OAN person? Are you a MSNBC person? Where are you getting your information? So access is multifaceted in this way. How do I get it? What can I get? And access is different when you think about a global population and societies that have filters around the internet. So information I may see, others in another country may not be able to see because it's been filtered through their internet. And so that's an access question as well, right? So the foundation is access. And then that's about skills and both disposition. Do you know how to get there? And then do you have the inclination that once you are there, not to just take what's fed to you, but to check those facts 3 or 4 times around? And then that's the analyzation part. So part one is access and part two is analyzing. And analyzing is not something that is innate to humans outside of what we know from brain science. Is it scary? Do I need to run? Is it a fight or flight? When we're talking about critical thinking and we're talking about analyzing media, you have to ask the questions of who made this message, who funded this message, why did I find this message where I found it, who is the target audience for this message, what are they hoping that what are they hoping to share with me or provoke for me? I mean, analyzing media is huge. And when we're talking about media, we're talking about, you know, print on paper, print now on the computer, podcasts. What we're doing right now is, a version of a radio. This is media as well. TVs, movies, multimedia things on the internet, all of that is something that should be analyzed because all media messages are constructed.
And I hear you saying there's a thoughtfulness. There's an approach to media. Before we came on the show here, we were talking a bit about Mike Caulfield, who's done some work developing strategies, and he has something he calls the SIFT method. His first move, as he calls it, and it's reminding me of what you're talking about, is stop. Just stop. We've been sort of trained, or we've internalized the speed of the internet becomes the speed at which we use the internet. Where we move so quickly, and sometimes just slowing down and thinking about something before you start ingesting it may be the best thing you can do.
Part of that, and I appreciated, it's sort of, I would say it's an additional layer to media literacy, the SIFT method that was developed. The stop, investigate, find trusted coverage, and then trace, right? That's the SIFT method. I appreciate that layer on top of these four foundations because something that we now know through examination, but is I guess, an unintended or unknown that has become it's become a huge issue in our society is how we as humans interact with the machines in terms of our basic physiology. And so we're talking about brain science here right now. And we're talking about every time I am, if you've seen the movie The Social Network, and I highly recommend if you haven't seen it that you do, sorry, The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I highly recommend it. I use it in my classes this fall as part of that stop move to understand how these things were constructed, what was their original intent versus how they are being used now. But every time you are scrolling or being presented with new information, there is that dopamine feedback loop. It is pleasurable, it is good, and it's very hard for us as humans to control that when it's good. I mean, this is why, some of us have difficulty with not consuming too much of a good thing, whether it be media or food or substances. We want pleasure as humans. We want to avoid pain. That is still part of the human condition. Our technology has advanced to the further than our understanding of our own humanity of how we interact with those things. And so the stop part is really important. The question is, how do you get someone to stop? And I think about this is over a decade ago, teaching a information media literacy class to ninth graders in Brooklyn, New York, when computing was still relatively new in schools. And this was supposed to be a class about skills for high school. The librarians taught research skills. I taught how to spot fake information on the internet, how to build web pages, how to do desktop navigation, basic things. But I had one student in particular who came into the classroom and he sat down at the computer and he started playing a game. And he did this almost every class period. And finally, it was like, stop, let's come together, stop, let's come together. And finally, I just said to him one day, what's going on? This is like an automatic behavior. And he told me that when he was in elementary school and middle school, it was a reward behavior for doing his homework. And I was like, okay, so you were programmed to do this. And that's when I started talking about programming and social programming and the choices that we make. But that dopamine feedback loop is huge. I don't know if you've ever seen those videos on the internet. I know you have young people in your own house, but try and take an iPhone away from a toddler, you're in for a fight.
I've seen it. That's why they never got their hands on it for that exact reason. Yeah, that's it. So I think the SIFT The four moves that Caulfield outlines, I think, probably dovetail nicely with your third principle, which is evaluate media. So how does that what does that look like in the classroom?
Well, this is the part, right? We're all of us as human beings bring to our understanding of the world our experiences and then whatever academic research that may go with that. And when I say academic research, schooling is an academic process, right? We want young humans to know certain things about the world so they can hopefully contribute to the world and understand the history of humanity and help us all move forward. I'm always leaning toward the positive here. So that's what I hope, right? That's why you go to school, become a citizen, hopefully contribute to the world, help us solve some of these problems, be nice to each other, don't hit, don't bite, keep your hands to yourself. Um, so the evaluation piece is really contextual in that you bring to it your understanding. So, your understandings of how gender works in the world or gender expression works in the world, your personal belief system, or perhaps a religious belief system, are all lenses through which you are then digesting information. So, when in a school, when you're teaching the evaluate piece, you want to teach the core concrete research skills of evaluating your source. Who is this voice? Is this a trusted voice? Where has it come from? Can I cross-reference this one fact that I find here? Can I find that fact also recorded several other places? The world is more connected in some ways, connected digitally, but more disconnected in some ways in terms of understanding who we are, because that evaluation piece has is missing. Um, Most adults today, I mean, like I said, I'm a proud Gen Xer, so we were that first wave of early adopters on the internet, right? And then we have these generations below us that quote unquote grew up on the internet. So if you think about, for instance, the baby boomers, which are my parents' generation, that evaluate skill. I don't know about you, but I have several aunts who have to say, this is chainmail. It is not true. Here is the Snopes article. To the point where I've said to one aunt, if you send me something that you haven't fact checked yourself, I'm gonna like pick up the phone and call you. And she's like, but I just think you need to know, you know. And again, this is part of human behavior. We now know that bad information spreads 6 times faster than truthful information. And if you again take that out of the internet and take it to an analog example, right? Dan, you and I are lucky enough to go out to lunch together somewhere at a cafe that I love, and I want you to really try this sandwich. It has this fantastic aioli on it. I love it. I get the sandwich and I go, ooh, Dan, this doesn't smell right. It's bad. The first thing I say is, Dan, smell this. Right? As humans, we share these experiences with each other. Oh my God, this is awful. Let me tell you about how awful it is. That comes from that initial, right? Sharing danger is what has allowed our species to evolve. So that's a very human thing. It requires a conscious effort to go, oh, this is horrible, but wait, is this true? Before I pass it on and share it with others, which is why I'm really appreciative of the filters that have been put on Twitter in particular. And I myself, I am a human being, even someone who loves these issues. I get an article, I go, this is awesome. And then I get that pop up. Do you want to read it first?
So yesterday I heard a story about this new service, I guess you'd call it. Twitter has launched called Birdwatch. They're asking selected users to participate in basically moderating what's on Twitter in hopes of reducing some of the falsehoods. But then one of the reporters in the story made the comment that, but even on Twitter, people can't agree what is truth. People can't agree
Yes.
what is real news. So,
Yes.
how can we talk to students about where they place their trust, what they can believe, let's just talk about just the news media, consuming
Sure.
current events.
One of the results, if you will, of us becoming a more interconnected society, and let's talk specifically about this country. Let's talk specifically about the United States and the prevalence of smartphones in particular and internet connectivity is that anybody can be an author or a publisher of information. Information is not fact. And there has been a blurring of that, right? It's become, if you are the loudest voice in the room, the internet room, right? You have the largest platform, people may listen to that more than other voices. And the quickness of things, it's almost as if we have developed a difficulty with a long-term memory in terms of society. I find it fascinating myself, and when I run into students who are dismissing long-established, trusted institutions, um, and they dismiss them, and I'll say, what proof do you have? How did this understanding come to be? And I am the type of teacher, students know that I mix reading, it's what I'm called at my school, will always speak the real. And so I will say something like, you've been on the planet for 14 years. This institution has been around for 120 years. And they have had no less than 100 employees every year working together in collective purpose to establish what we understand as truth. And they are often verified by this other institution and this other institution. So, why, in your 14 years on the planet, have you decided that this 120-year-old institution is something that cannot be trusted? And I've had one student go, "You're mocking me." And I said, "I'm not. I'm genuinely curious. I'm trying to have a dialogue with you." And in civil discourse, when you put out an opinion or an idea, you should be able to support what you said. And so I'm looking for what your thinking process is. Please explain it to me because I also want to understand. Sometimes I end up in a great debate. I'm still in a debate with someone who graduated 4 years ago from my school. And periodically, this person will send me an article. What do you think about this? And then we'll enter an email exchange about that. But some of this also has to do with the internet, in many ways, has quickened society. And we have what I would call micro generations, right? People have talked about this in terms of media and where you enter in. Um, so understandings are constructed out of those experiences, and we're all experiencing some form of myopia here, in that the way that the algorithms work is I'm constantly being fed things that reaffirm my own bias, right? So we're working with confirmation bias here, and it's really hard to get out of those cycles. Many people don't even know how to get out of that cycle. And if I'm constantly getting things that reaffirm my worldview and my understanding, why would I choose to get out of that cycle if I don't have the disposition to evaluate for further and deeper understanding? Um, in the long conversation about education, my career has been in independent schools, right? I have not worked extensively with public schools, although I have watched the evolution of curriculum over time and the initiatives of No Child Left Behind and then Common Core. Some of what's missing is this commonality of civics in the world, and how to have that discourse with one another, practice that discourse with one another. Watching adults engage in quote unquote cancel culture, I don't like what you've said, therefore I am not going to listen to you anymore, is, in my opinion, so third grade. That's so third grade. I don't like you, therefore I'm not going to listen. As opposed to, I might learn something, maybe I'm wrong, maybe this might help me understand the world in a different way so we can move forward together. We just, the stakes are too high for us to continue to throw away those that we disagree with.
Yeah, I was talking with a couple episodes ago with Joel Westheimer. He's done a lot of thinking about civics education, and he was talking about exactly that. This idea that the practice of civil discourse has slipped away in schools, and he places the blame at the foot of curriculum, too much content, too much reliance on test scores. What about media literacy? Why is that not more prevalent in schools? I tend to get blank stares from fellow teachers if I say it. Honestly, media literacy to most people I know is a works cited page. We're talking really base level stuff. And I think for a lot of teachers, they would not see media literacy as their job, quote unquote, because they've got their stuff they need to get through. And media literacy does not fit into that. I don't know if that squares with your experience.
Some of this, I think what we are experiencing is a moment in society, and it could be a 50-year moment when you look at the longer view of society. But as schools moved more toward testing, right, and evaluating around test scores, as opposed to looking at education as a civic process of raising critically minded citizens, um, we lost something. And part of this is just the evolution of the United States of America. When, again, I'm talking about this country in specific. As our society has become more racially diverse, and we have not engaged in a large scale campaign to talk about what this means as a multiracial democracy and how to talk to people across difference, people shy away from talking about things that may fall into what we would consider the things that parents should talk about at home. Schools have shied away from this for fear of falling into getting into trouble, quite honestly, around cultural things, getting into trouble. If we start talking about your beliefs and why do you believe that, there is a shying away from that because there, in my opinion, because there hasn't been a large scale campaign for us to figure out how to do it well. And media literacy falls squarely at the intersection of all of those things. Where you get your information, how you understand the world, what's your belief system. And the reason I say a moment is because if you think about the teaching population and their own K-12 experience, and I'm someone who's old enough that some of the teachers today were my own students when they were in elementary school. And I think about the schools that I worked in, which were definitely on the progressive end of education and early adoption of new ideas. Most schools didn't teach media literacy in terms of critically dissecting what we're doing. We got really excited by what kids could do with media, but we didn't teach the skills of every time you encounter something, you need to investigate where it came from. And I will also tell you, when you're under the tsunami of this, it is exhausting to do all the time. It's 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 an it's this is our reason um, interjecting itself into again like doom scrolling, right? That dopamine loop. Our reason has to stop us in there and go, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And so the examination of self and participation in that way is something that many of us, we don't teach it in schools. And now we have this whole mindfulness track, right, in schools. But prior to this modern era, we didn't teach that in the same way. It was all about, can you perform, can you absorb, can you output in a certain way. And we as a society are still trying to figure out how to listen to voices that may present ideas of difference. And so if I'm a critical thinker and I am examining what, even just what I'm reading, right, in ninth grade, well, depending on the power structure of your school, I, as a ninth grade student, can't say to the teacher, I find this book offensive and why am I reading it? I just have to digest it and move forward. And if I'm not having those conversations at home, where am I getting any practice for these skills? And so,
I know you're also a big fan of thinking routines, and I think there's a certain parallel there with media literacy that we need to get to a place where students have internalized and will do it on their own and don't need us there to guide them.
right.
Yeah. How about the last piece of this is creation? I think back to this question of digital natives. I know I'm guilty of this. Assuming too much about what the students can do with creation, and being constantly surprised. Recently, I asked my students to create audio files, and they were just turning in like MP4s with a black screen. Like that's not an audio file. Come on. But then I had to check myself. Like, oh, why am I assuming they know how to do this? And that's not even taking into account how to create responsibly. So, talk to me about creation.
I'm constantly surprised when teachers, I mean, it came into professional development and that teachers were evaluated on their adoption of media in their classes, right? And at first it was like, my kids type their papers, yay, we use computers, and then it was, well, instead of the book report, I've allowed them to create a video for it, for creative expression, right? And we talk about differentiation in the classroom. Um, but if the students have not been through the critical analysis of the access and analyze and evaluate. When you ask them to create, there's no critical thought in the creation either. So you said you're surprised when your students would turn in, files that are not audio. As a photographer and as a digital media artist, one of the perennial conversations I have is that photos aren't free on the internet. I have to have the conversation that music is not actually free on the internet. Because of the classes I teach, I always do a survey with my students about their media usage and their media diets. And when I explain, tracing it back, they're musicians who make money from this, and when you steal it, this is what's happening. Um, just tracing how this works in our society, many of them are like, really? I had no idea, because I could just go here and click, and why is this a bad thing? Now we're back to the conversation, over a decade ago about Bitport and sharing. And, there are some people who believe that everything should be free. And I'm like, but people have to eat. Money is a social construct, but it's real. Race is a social construct, but it's real. So in that creation piece, and yes, I am a fan of thinking routines, but thinking routines are a tool to cultivate a disposition or a habit of mind. And once you've engaged in that critical thinking over time, it becomes the way in which you engage in the world. You have to not just have the skills, but you also have to have the inclination to use those skills. You have to have the ability and the inclination to use them when it's important. And these ideas I'm talking about are not mine, right? I'm talking about Project Zero, and I'm talking about Ron Richard and the power of making thinking visible. I'm talking about, agency by design. I have been steeped in Project Zero work. I would say closely over 8 years, but I've been working with and following the researchers and the projects for 20 plus years as it evolved, just through my own graduate studies. And so when it came together, under this umbrella, I was like, this is what it is. It makes sense. Let's keep going. Here's some awesome tools. So even when I read when I read Mike Caulfield's SIFT, I said, this is a thinking routine. This is what it is. If you use it in the right way, this is what it is. And if students internalize the process, this helps them develop a critical sensitivity to the design of media, which they then can apply when they create media, right? A sensitivity to, what am I doing? What is the message I'm trying to create? What is my audience? What beliefs and biases am I bringing to this process? What is the ethical use of media moving forward? No, I can't just steal images off the internet. No, I can't just steal songs off the internet. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And also, we're in a place where we know that nothing ever disappears off the internet. And so by creating this, what impact am I having moving forward? What impact am I having moving forward in that way? And I think, again, I also live in a bubble. I recognize this. Um, I think we're beyond the point, and I think what's going on publicly in our country right now should be an example of this, where people think they can just post things on the internet and it will have no consequence later on. When I was doing teacher training many years ago about, you know, internet use and media use, I had a question from a young teacher that went like this. I graduated from college 2 years ago and I'm trying to get a job. But when I was an undergrad, I was in a fraternity, which I will not name, of course. And one of our things was seniors would run across campus streaking, holding fire torches. And so they have me on video running across campus streaking. And I contacted the national chapter to take it down, but they won't, because it's owned by them. And I was up for a job and I was told I couldn't be hired because when they searched me on the internet, this is what they found, right? And I was like, "Yup, I completely understand. Yup." And this is pre-social media. This was just on a. I think we're beyond that, where students understand what they put out there can live forever. But when we talk about ethical use, and when I talk about photography and film in that way, why are you taking this picture? Where will it live? What is the context around here? And we talk about context a lot. What is outside of the frame that you don't see that may affect your understanding of what's going on? That's a question I want you to always have when you interact with media. What is outside of the frame that we don't see, that it may impact my understanding of what's going on? It's been curated for my digestion. The curator made choices. What choices did they make? What was influencing the choices that they made? I want our students to develop that, because hopefully, if they internalize that, then it may change what we put out there in the world, and why.
As you said, it's a tsunami. It can be when you're under it. What advice would you give a teacher listening who is keen on starting to integrate some media literacy, but maybe feels like it is a tsunami when they look at some resources?
We all use media of some form in our classes, right? Whether we are assigned to, you're an English teacher and you have to teach these books, or you choose to because you're trying to diversify your curriculum and your interaction with the students. You're using podcasts, you're using movies, you're using, educational videos. When you are asking your students to engage in research of any kind is a perfect entry point for introducing the media literacy skills. And I do suggest that you partner with your librarians because they are our research experts in our communities on how to do these research skills in a way that helps your students evaluate what they're doing um, for their own edification on the one hand. On the other hand, if you are using media as part of your assignments, I'm going to say to you, less is more. Less is more. You're not assigning a 5-minute movie for the students to do. You're assigning a 3-minute video, which is ethically done and is full of content and is not about the bells and whistles. Um, that's hard when we as teachers may not understand what the bells and whistles are. And so I would say for yourself, you've got to do some of your own research and understanding, and you have to do some reflection on your own habits and your own media diet as well. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. We're all allowed to guilty pleasure, but what are you constantly choosing to consume, and how does that affect your beliefs about the world? Um, that developing that sensitivity, I also think reduces our stress level in terms of what we're taking in and understanding our place in the world. So for teachers who are looking to do that, there's some great communities out there that talk about this as well, depending on what your PLN looks like, right? Your professional learning network.
Sure.
Um,
What's a
I
good
would
first stop? What's a good first stop for teachers?
I would familiarize yourself with the 4 principles of media literacy from I think it's the Media Literacy Foundation. Um, so many of these media literacy organizations, which were robust 15 years ago, have because they were also publicly funded, um, do not receive as much funding right now. But the tenets and the principles are still the same, and I think they're still as necessary as ever in that way. So first stop is understanding those 4 tenets, and then from there, again, I am a big proponent of Project Zero thinking routines in that way. Um, if you look up on the internet the Project Zero toolbox, you'll land on a page which gives you a list of many thinking routines based on what type of thinking you want your students to do. And again, we're trying to develop a disposition, a habit of mind. We're trying to cultivate a culture of thinking here. And so these are things you can practice and they work with your existing content. You're not adding anything new. It's a different way of presenting your existing content, which leads to deeper engagement in the classroom. It's that critical thinking piece that has to become a habit. That has to become a habit. And a habit is based on, practice. You have to be intentional about this. It does require a different type of planning, but I've been teaching for 20 plus years now, and I will tell you that when I use thinking routines with my students, especially around our engagement with media and our creation of media, the conversations are rich. The students have uncovered so much about what they've absorbed and what they understand in the world. I can see how these things may affect what they believe and what they understand. It's a place for authentic communication and connection with my students. And what they create on the other end is mind blowing. And I'll give you just one example from this fall. I teach an advanced photography class. One of my students, I've taught her since she was in ninth grade. She's now in 11th grade. And their project for the semester is they are supposed to create a multi-layered piece of photography that is a commentary on other pieces of art or their experiences in the world. And this student ended up creating a collage of herself and her family. And the title of her image is Disney Lied to Me. She has pictures of family vacations, of princesses, and she and her sisters dressed up like princesses. And then beyond, I guess the second or third layer beyond that is images of protests from last summer. There are images of politicians fighting. There are images from recent movies that have been salient for her generation. And when I saw this final piece, I could recognize, because I've been in conversation with her for 3 years, the evolution of her thinking and the critical approach that she took to creating this piece of artwork. Um, that's what we want our kids to understand. I said to her, "Does this mean you don't enjoy Disney movies anymore?" She goes, "Oh, I definitely enjoy them, but I understand them for what they are, and I don't see them as trying to give me the world that I should live in. That's a choice I could make now, and I can enjoy them for what they are over there, and that's very different." Um,
No longer a passive consumer.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Kerri, I really appreciate the depth of thought you've brought to this conversation. You're going to have to come back because we have a lot more to talk about. I do want to get you out of here on this. I know you are a lover of graphic novels, sci-fi. You got any recommendations for my listeners?
If you haven't already read the Binti series, it is a 3 book series, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the author's name. I'm a person who's differently abled. I'm hard of hearing, and so I often have to replicate like parrot symbols. I have to pare it back in terms of learning pronunciation. But the series is Binti, Binti. It's 3 books. Read it now because I believe this series has been picked up by Hulu, and this author is about to take off. If you haven't already read George Takei's novel about Japanese internment, I highly recommend that.
So
I
good.
mean,
So good.
yeah, yes, consumed in an afternoon. So those would be my two right now.
Kerri Redding from the Washington International School. So many great thoughts about media literacy, digital literacy, and just cultures of thinking in the classroom. I really appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much for joining me.
Dan, thanks so much for being here. I'm happy to come back.
A huge thanks to Kerri Redding for joining me to talk about this essential and often overlooked or missing element of education. Hopefully, as you were listening, you were able to reflect on your own school or your child's school and ask yourself, is media literacy part of the program? Are we giving students a chance to access different media? It's a new media landscape we live in than where we grew up. And does school reflect that? And then are students being given the skills and the opportunity to analyze and evaluate media so they're not graduating, going out in the world and frankly believing everything they read online or instinctively mistrusting certain and reputable news sources simply because they've been told they should. This is real critical thinking. We talk about critical thinking. Critical thinking gets ridiculed in some corners. You can't teach it. Well, media literacy says you can. And if you agree with Kerri's assessment that media literacy is a bit of a tsunami and you don't know where to start, check out the show notes today. Lots of things in there. I would key in on the 4 principles of media literacy. It's a great place to get grounded and start planning for your own classroom. All right. Thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea. Hope you took something away from today's episode, and check us out next time.
Hoy es el día que extraño.